President and CBO of the Henry Ford.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Henry Ford on this chilly Sunday afternoon. I am absolutely thrilled to be here with all of you and to welcome you to this very special event. Thank you for taking the time to join us this weekend to honor and celebrate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Your presence and support make inspiring programs such as this possible, and we simply cannot do the important work that we do without all of you. At the Henry Ford, as all of you know, we preserve and elevate the stories of America, the stories of courage, stories of resilience, of innovation. We take great pride in being a place of learning, a place of education, of inspiration, of reflection, and of important lessons and conversations like the one we're about to have today. And we are so fortunate to welcome back to our campus renowned historian and New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Jeanne Theoharis. Her latest book, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life of struggle outside of the South, illuminates the work of Dr. King's activism beyond the American South and expands our understanding of his life and his work through his time in cities like Boston, like New York, and like Los Angeles, places that Dr. Theoharis believed were at the heart of his campaign for racial justice. As we prepare to open the Jackson Home, I'm sure all of you have heard about that, in Greenfield Village in June, a site deeply connected to Dr. King's leadership and his commitment to justice, we believe that this event today provides further insight into this man's enduring impact on our world. A distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York, Dr. Theoharis is the author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, which won the 2014 NAACP Image Award and was adapted into a documentary. Her writing has appeared in publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, Slate, and The Atlantic. She is joined today by the Henry Ford's Curator of Black History, Amber Mitchell. Amber is a public historian and educator and worked at Whitney Plantation, the National World War II Museum, and the American Association for State and Local History before joining the Henry Ford. She holds a master's degree in history from Indiana University and a bachelor's in history from Wayne State University. And we are thrilled that she has joined the Henry Ford a few years ago and is part of our terrific team. Just outside this theater, immediately following our talk today, you can purchase a copy of King of the North, and we'll host a book signing with Dr. Theoharis. So I hope you can join us for that as well. Thank you again for spending your afternoon with us today. I encourage you all to join us tomorrow for the Dr. Martin Luther King Day holiday, as we will unveil to the public, and this is pretty exciting for us, for the first time and for only one day, a powerful and newly preserved artifact, the floral upholstered chair, living room chair from the Jackson home, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sat as he watched President Lyndon B. Johnson's televised address pledging federal action on voting rights, a moment that helped accelerate the passage of the Voting Rights Act. This is the chair he was seated in when he was photographed watching LBJ, and it was on the cover of Life magazine. We are once again waiving admission for the day tomorrow, so as many people that can join us are able to come. So I hope you and your families can join us for a full schedule of events that includes musical performances, dramatic presentations, screening, and other opportunities for reflection. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeanne Theoharis and Amber Mitchell. Please give them a warm welcome and thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yep.
So nice to see each of you, and thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful conversation on, I would argue, one of the most important books on Dr. King in the last several years, King of the North. It is my pleasure and honor to be with you here today. I'm Amber Mitchell. I serve as the Curator of Black History here at the Henry Ford, and I have the pleasure of being able to be a part of a massive team working to preserve all kinds of histories, including African American stories, and of course our big project being the Jackson House right now. But my role today, of course, is moderator of this conversation. And so I want to welcome you again, Dr. Theoharis. It's always wonderful to be in conversation with you.
It is so nice to be back in Detroit.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so let's maybe just hop to it. So this book, King of the North, and I'm gonna sit it up high because you should always show off the material. So this book, King of the North, I have to say, like I just mentioned, I know I kind of gushed over it a little bit earlier, that it is absolutely incredible, and I think everybody should read it. If you want to learn something a lot different than mainstream narratives about who Dr. King was, who his family was, and of course the work that he did in places like Detroit, I think this is a definite one-stop shop kind of narrative around that. And so, Dr. Theoharis, what drove you to write this book?
Oh, thank you. So this book starts, and I don't realize I'm starting it, like more than 15 years ago. I was in LA, I had a fellowship, and I was studying the civil rights movement in Los Angeles in the decade before the Watts Uprising. And there was a very big movement in the city against the segregated schools, against the segregated housing in Southern California, against police brutality. And I'm going through LA's two big Black newspapers at the time. And I keep finding Dr. King in the city. And here he is in 1962, 3 years before the Watts Uprising, talking about the pattern of police brutality in the city and calling out the police murder of Ron Stokes. Again, an incident we often associate with Malcolm X, but Dr. King is there as well. Here he is in 1963, a couple weeks before the March on Washington, marching against LA's segregated schools. Here he is over and over and over in 1964, calling out housing segregation in Los Angeles and a dangerous proposition on the ballot that's trying to retain the right for Californians to discriminate in the sale and rental of their property. And King is calling it a vote for ghettos, and he's calling it one of the most shameful tragedies of the 20th century. And I realized that the story that is basically told in most books and most documentaries was wrong, right? That story is, right, we begin with Dr. King in 1955 in Montgomery, and it's a Southern story, and we have, struggle and hardship, and then we get the Civil Rights Act, and we get the Voting Rights Act, and then a couple weeks later, Watts erupts. And according to that story, King discovers the North, and he discovers the issues of Northern Black people, and that leads him to turn north, again, as the story in most biographies go, and base a campaign in Chicago. And that's a comfortable story, I realized, but it's not true. And once I saw him in LA, you remember those kaleidoscopes we had as kids? Where you would turn just it a little bit and the whole picture would change? That's what this was like. Because once I saw it, I saw him everywhere. And things that I knew all of a sudden changed. So how many people know that Dr. King went to Boston University? Mom. Right, many of us know this. But until I sort of saw this new story, it hadn't occurred to me that I needed to think about what it was like for Dr. King in his early 20s to live in Boston. Guess what? When he moves to Boston at age 21, no one will rent to him. Now, when I say that out loud, that's not surprising given what we know about Boston in the 1950s. But that's not the story we usually tell. Often when we talk about Dr. King's schooling, he goes to, just to remind us, he goes to Morehouse for college, but then he goes to Crozier Seminary, which is in Pennsylvania, And then he gets his PhD in Boston. And usually when we talk about that Crozier and BU part, it's all about who he studied with, what he's learning. And that's really important. But the other thing we need to think about is he spends basically 6 formative years becoming an adult outside of the South, both experiencing the fact that segregation is not a Southern problem, it's a national cancer, and also experiencing that Northern liberals are not so liberal at home. Northern allies who might be talking about the problem in the South get wobbly when you get closer to home. So he has that experience. And so once again, we can talk more about the kaleidoscope, but once you turn the kaleidoscope, the whole story we tell of Dr. King, from him coming of age to the assassination, really changes.
Dr. Theoharis, there wasn't racism outside the South, right? You're not telling us that, are you?
Right, and I think we're going to go a step farther, right? Because I think most of us, and most books, will talk about racism outside the South. But do you remember this, maybe from high school or college, where they had this de facto de jure distinction? So that distinction actually comes about in the aftermath of the Brown decision, in some ways to make Northerners feel better about the fact that their schools do look segregated because they're all black or all white, but Northerners don't want to, in many ways, like to think of themselves as open and tolerant. So a way to sort of cast that segregation as different and also outside of the law and policy. And that is a deep distortion, right? There are different ways to segregate schools through the law and policy. Now, in many places in the Deep South, in the 50s and 60s, you had laws that said white students need to go over here and black students need to go over there. You don't necessarily have that here in Detroit or in LA, but what you do have is something called zoning. What's zoning? It's where you're zoned school. It's where you're told to go to school. Now those zones, those zoning districts, they're not created by God or rivers, right? I'm being sassy, but there's a point here. They're created by public officials. And they redraw the boundaries, and they create the boundaries over and over. And particularly in a city like Detroit, they're constantly redrawing those boundaries, particularly in the era that we're talking about, 50s and 60s, as we have a huge swell in black migration to the city, to maintain those white schools and black schools. Another way is about teachers, right? And in fact, segregation outside the South was actually a little different in terms of teachers. Black teachers had tremendous difficulty getting hired in Detroit, in Boston, in New York, in LA, in Chicago, even in black schools. These were jobs largely given and reserved for white people. So part of the struggle, again, in places like Detroit, is also to press for the kind of equal hiring of black teachers and black administrators. So to go back to the original point, like, not only are we talking about racism or in a place like Detroit, we're talking about systematic, right? Public, like, sponsored and maintained segregation. And that's what Dr. King is going to be, because again, once he's had this experience, he doesn't, and this is also true of Curator, we'll get to her in a minute. She also comes of age in the North. And so there's never a moment they don't know it. And so then it is not surprising, for instance, when Dr. King writes his first book after the Montgomery bus boycott, that he's calling on Northerners both to pay attention to what's happening in the South, but he's also calling on Northerners to be actually paying attention to where they are, and for a Northern liberalism that's actually liberal at home, that you don't just call out the outrages in Mississippi, you call out the outrages in Michigan. And he'll say that for the 1950s onward.
So I really appreciate you naming specifically that these are policies input by people, right?
Yes.
I think oftentimes when we talk about the systematic oppression of African Americans and other groups in the United States, it's almost as if these things just came out and
Or fizzer, yeah, just like floating.
you know, schools were segregated and then they said
Nobody did it.
everything was fine. Nobody actually worked. Like, no, this was a policy that was created by people who set out to maintain the system that put them in the top and others at the bottom, right? But I think you just mentioned Mrs. King, and I think that that's probably the secondary layer to his entire book, entire narrative, and a story that we definitely do not speak of in the terms that you do in your book. Mrs. King herself was a radical hidden of herself. In fact, she radicalizes her husband.
Yes, she does. So the first thing to know about Coretta Scott King is that she's more of an activist than Martin Luther King when they meet. So let me just give you a little bit of background. Coretta Scott King grows up outside of Marion, Alabama, in a very proud farming family. Her dad owns his own land. He owns a lumber business. Whites in Alabama don't like that. They burned down their house at one point. They burned down its business at one point. So from a very early age, she is used to what happens to people who stand up. She and her older sister Edith are the first Black students to go to Antioch in decades. Antioch College is in Ohio. And it's probably the most liberal college in the nation at that point, maybe. And it's a tremendous opening experience in some ways, right? Her politics just really blossom. But she also encounters, right? She's one of just a couple of Black students of what it's like to be at a prominent white institution and the kinds of segregation she faces. Coretta Scott majors in music and education. And so like all education majors, she has to student teach, except that Yellow Springs, Ohio, which is where Antioch is located, doesn't want any Black person student teaching in their schools, so forbids that. And then Antioch sides with Yellow Springs and basically says to her, you should go and student teach in this Black town called Xenia. And she's like, no. You know, basically, I didn't pay this money, I didn't come here. She's using already a kind of frame of like the United States, you know, calls itself a democracy, and yet this is how I'm being treated. But many of her classmates, including herself, they're protesting the Cold War, they're protesting segregation in the United States. And so she goes to some of these classmates and she says, will you join me going to the president of Antioch to protest this decision? And none of those classmates, these are classmates that are protesting the Korean War, no one will go with her. So she has this experience, this is before she meets Martin Luther King, also of allies growing wobbly when having to confront inequality at home. Also, when she's at Antioch, she gets involved in the Progressive Party. I don't know if people know the Progressive Party. It's a third party that's formed in many ways to challenge the Democratic Party from the left. In 1948, they're running Henry Wallace for president, both around issues, domestic issues of segregation and economic inequality in the United States, but also challenging kind of Cold War militarism. Now, I want to say those words again to you because the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, that's an idea we tend to associate with Dr. King in his last year. Coretta Scott is coming with that understanding. She goes to the Progressive Party convention, one of about 150 Black people there out of more than 3,000 other delegates. It is through her Progressive Party work that she meets Paul Robeson, she meets Bayard Rustin. So let me put that a different way. She has met Paul Robeson and Bayard Rustin long before she meets Martin Luther King. Okay. So after Antioch, she goes to the New England Conservatory of Music, which is also in Boston, because she's thinking she wants a vocal career. And through a friend who knows Martin, like sort of introduces them. And at first, she's not interested. She doesn't want to date a minister. Most ministers, are all about, this is her words, suits and sanctimony. They're narrow. And she's a deep Christian, let me be clear about that. But to her, being a Christian is what you do in your life. But she agrees, they go on a lunch date. They talk about racism and capitalism on their first date. Like any good first,
As one would.
as one would, as one would. Martin is smitten. He's never met someone like her. He says at the end of the date, you have everything I want in a wife. You're beautiful, you're smart, you're principled. And she's like, you don't even know me. And one of the things that again, in researching this part of the book, like she is making him bring his A game. Like,
Yes, she should.
yeah, she should, right? He tries out some lines that weekend. He's like, I'm Napoleon, you're my Waterloo. And she's like, intellectual jive is what she calls it. Her words, not mine. But she does agree to another date. And one of the reasons that she falls in love with him, so she's really he has a big vision and she's really taken with this vision. She also talks about how he's a listener. And we're going to come back to that because I heard that over and over from people. And that's not something I think we often talk about in terms of Dr. King. We're so used to seeing him on the pulpit, on the dais, when many people, including gang leaders in Chicago, and we can get to that, talk about him as a real listener and as not judgy. And I say that because sometimes people today roll out Dr. King as some sort of judgy finger wager, and that really doesn't do justice to who he was, and in many ways what she fell in love with. She's really taken with his vision. Some of her friends worry, is he really going to amount to much, right? Is your life getting smaller by marrying him? But they get married in 1953, in June of 53. She does not wear white. She wears a light blue dress. She doesn't wear it to the floor, like a tea length. And she makes her very imposing father-in-law take Obey out of the vows because, as she puts it, it makes her feel like an indentured servant. So this is who Martin Luther King marries. And he is marrying her in many ways, because of this, not in spite of this. And so I think seeing that their relationship is also a political and intellectual partnership, and that she will be one of his, if not his, one of his key advisors, till the end of his life. And I think we often miss that, right? We often, and Dr. King had complicated gender politics, right? He both wanted a wife who was an intellectual equal, who he could talk to, he could talk about ideas at the same time, and they would argue about this. He really saw her as being responsible for taking care of their kids. She's wanting to have more, sometimes wanting him to do with more of that. But I think understanding that partnership, that kind of meeting of the minds, that is what happens when they get married. And she's fierce. I'm going to tell one more story about her. They spend their first year of marriage in Boston. An interviewer in 1968 says, "Oh, what was it like beginning your marriage in integrated Boston?" And she's like, "No, it was not integrated. We talked about it all the time." So one of my favorite things about her is she's like, "No." And then he's called to the pulpit at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. And they make the decision to go to Montgomery. And they have their first daughter on November 17th, 1955. And for the people who are paying attention, this is 2 weeks before longtime activist Rosa Parks makes her bus stand. And the Women's Political Council calls for a boycott. And Dr. King is in many ways thrust into a leadership position, in part because he's willing to speak at the first mass meeting, and a lot of the ministers are worried that that will hurt them. So about 2 months into the boycott, the king's house gets bombed. And Coretta and baby Yolanda, who's now about 10 weeks old, are home. And she thinks really fast. She gets them out. So she's 28. Dr. King was 27. As you might imagine, both families, both dads are furious. They're terrified. They both come to Montgomery that night and are like, you need to get out of here. And if you're not willing to get out of here, at least, Coretta and the baby need to be out of here. And she's like, no, we're not going anywhere. And I think that fierceness, that ability, not to not be afraid, but to be able to move while being afraid, to be able to stand, to stand while you're afraid, right? Many people described her to me as being beyond steel, right? That she had a kind of core. And that, again, the leader he becomes, he can't become that without her, right? That partnership and then that steel that she brings, I think.
So let's move into when Dr. King starts shifting, I wouldn't say shifting priorities, but thinking about moving more directly up north and taking actions up there. And we know he comes to the Detroit area several times, of course. He goes to LA, obviously. We also know he goes to Chicago.
Right.
And it's well documented that Dr. King mentions, like, some of the times where he felt most in fear of his life were in Chicago and was here as well.
For sure. So one of the things in the early 60s that I think we need to understand is Dr. King sees as part of his leadership showing up for other people's struggles. Like, that part of his call is being called to come to Detroit to support. So as we know, right, in June of 1963, he joins at the front, right, the Great Walk for Freedom here, to basically try to galvanize a kind of more, like, to lay down the law that, like, people have been protesting again around schools, around housing, around jobs, around police brutality, and it's time for a new day, right? And it's organized by Reverend C.L. Franklin, Reverend Albert Klee, and Dr. King is at the front, Rosa Parks is at the front. So obviously, Mrs. Parks is now living in Detroit, what she describes as the northern promised land that wasn't. So again, we often miss this aspect of his leadership. Is that he's here in New York supporting 1199 strike. He's here in LA, as I was mentioning. He's in Boston supporting the kind of school activism in Boston in the early 60s. He's in Chicago over and over, right? There's a massive, like, school movement in Chicago in the early 60s. 2 months after the March on Washington, there's a huge school boycott with numbers like half the, well, let me back up. Chicago is the second largest city in the United States at the time. It's a third African American, so 1 million Black people. By 1965, more Black people live in Chicago than in the whole state of Alabama, right? So this is an urgent fight. Dr. King, actually, in 1963, he's there in May for a freedom rally, and he says in 1963, alongside what they're doing in Birmingham, he calls Chicago as segregated as Birmingham. And he will come back a number of times to support, again, particularly this incredibly robust, direct action movement in Chicago. And kind of from 1963 on, he's thinking about the need to base an SCLC campaign in Chicago. Chicago activists are, asking him repeatedly to come. And so they make the decision in the spring of 1965. Again, just remembering where we are in history. The spring of 1965, that's the Selma to Montgomery March. That's the voting rights activism happening in Alabama. But at the very same time as he's engaged in that, he's also making the decision, right, that they need to sort of join this movement in Chicago, because He's also, how would I put this, galled at the fact that there is such a robust movement. He says if this movement had happened in the South, there would have been change. And so basically what the decision is to kind of join with, there's like a kind of coalition of civil rights groups in Chicago called the CCCO, headed by Al Raby. And Dr. King has been working with them and is impressed with them and impressed with the kind of movement they've built. And so they make the decision, right, that they're going to join together. And again, just keeping track of where we are in history. So we make the decision in April. They kick it off in July. And for everybody, just remembering that's a month before Watts. So they're already in Chicago. He doesn't decide. They kick it off in July. And then August is when Watts happens. And Dr. King will say to the mayor of LA, right, if you had listened, there would not have been a riot. Right, people have been protesting around police brutality. People have been protesting around this fierce housing and school segregation, right? So they're joining and in many ways expanding and really trying to take on what Dr. King is now calling domestic colonialism. And he's calling the situation of Black people in cities like Chicago or New York or Detroit domestic colonialism for a couple of reasons. One is the kind of ghettoization of Black people in these cities. So it's just in Chicago, it's on part of the South Side and part of the West Side. And then most of the rest of the city are like sundown neighborhoods and sundown towns. And when I use that phrase, that means that Black people might be able to work there during the day, but they're not safe there at night. And how much profit. So the first aspect that kind of sickens Dr. King is how much profit is made from that ghettoization, from that segregation. The second is the role of the police and the courts, and he called as kind of enforcers, as in many ways maintaining that segregation and ghettoization. The third is he will talk about kind of what he calls in Chicago plantation politics, or kind of a layer of Black people who have been elevated to high places, and in Chicago that is to serve the daily machine. And so they become a buffer and they become another barrier for the movement in Chicago. So a devastating thing happens in October of 1965. As you may know, right, one of the things that the Civil Rights Act, which is passed in the summer of 1964, does is that it ties federal funding of schools to school desegregation. So it allows the feds to be able to withhold funding if school districts aren't desegregating. So these activists in Chicago and Black parents file a complaint with what we would know as the Department of Education, but what is then called the Department of Housing, Education, and Welfare. And so they lay out, and they have like 20 examples of sort of how segregated the schools are in Chicago, how unequal, how overcrowded they are. One of the things that's happened in places like Chicago and Boston and New York is school officials have turned many Black schools into what they euphemistically call double session days, which sounds like whatever. But what it actually means is that they have one group of students go for 4 hours in the morning, and then a whole second group go for 4 hours in the afternoon. So basically cutting the school day in half for Black students, right? To be able to fit twice as many kids in the school and not to then like change those zoning to move some students into open spaces and white schools. So these Chicago parents and activists and Al Raby, they lay out all these details, and they send it to Hugh, that's Housing, Education, and Welfare, and they're like, if that's follow up, they ask the Chicago Board of Ed for things like class size and teacher placement. And the Board of Ed's like, we don't have to give that to you. And that's Chicago, that's not Jackson, Mississippi. And so they lay out, and they have like 20 examples of sort of how segregated the schools are in Chicago, how unequal, how overcrowded they are. One of the things that's happened in places like Chicago and Boston and New York is school officials have turned many Black schools into what they euphemistically call double session days, which sounds like whatever. But what it actually means is that And then, beginning of October 1965, the Department of Housing, Education, and Welfare finds the Chicago Public Schools in non-compliance, and they withhold $32 million. Okay? This is epic. Dr. King telegrams Johnson, this is exactly what we need. We need enforcement of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act doesn't mean anything if it's not enforced, right? These Chicago activists celebrate. But white Chicago is apoplectic. The mayor, the congressman, the Chicago Tribune, all sorts of white residents, they're furious. Many of these Chicago congressmen voted for the Civil Rights Act, but now they're pissed. They don't want this coming to their schools. And Daley gets on a plane and confronts Johnson. Johnson is in actually New York to meet the Pope. Daley's so angry that Johnson's late to meet the Pope. And basically, less than a week after Hugh had sort of withheld those $32 million, Johnson summons the head of Hugh and the deputy head, and basically is like, you better fix this. And less than a week later, that money is dispersed. Let me put it another way. President Johnson has basically stopped the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act against Chicago's segregated public schools. So this is a devastating blow. To further escalate that Chicago movement, the Kings decide to move to Chicago in January 1966. They get an apartment, a slum apartment on the West Side. And from the very first night, they have a lot of contact with, and Dr. King starts working with sort of gang members and gang leaders in Chicago. And like I mentioned before, they will talk, I mean, this is not a picture we're used to. We're used to thinking, oh, it's, you know, Dr. King wouldn't have, right, like this kind of distance between particularly like gang leaders, and they wouldn't have liked Dr. King at all, right? The way we think about it, it's like Malcolm, Malcolm worked with like urban black young men, not King. And I do think one of the things, again, with the kaleidoscope is seeing, no, I mean, yes, absolutely Malcolm did, but Dr. King really commits, like one of the big things he works on that year is sort of, in many ways, encouraging the leadership potential of these gang members, seeing them as brave, seeing them as organized, seeing them as a resource in this struggle. In part because, in many ways, Mayor Daley was a fierce segregationist. And he had, when we talk about the Daley machine, I think until I got knee deep in this research, I didn't really understand what that meant. What that means is they have so many levers of power that they can ride. It means that, for instance, some of the ministers, many black ministers were too scared to sort of be near the movement publicly, because some of the ministers who do, guess what? They get fined. They get, like, their building gets held up for 7 years. Or if you're living in public housing, you get kicked out of public housing, or you lose your benefits. Like, so many different levers of power to punish people who strayed. And straying was equated with sort of being a civil rights activist. Daley hated Dr. King, saw him as an outside agitator, saw him as a problem. One of the things about having that apartment on the West Side was just getting to see the level of inequality that was being perpetuated and countenanced by the city in 1966. A couple weeks after the Kings move in, a baby is basically bitten to death by rats. It's just, Dr. King will call it as much of a civil rights tragedy as the murder of Viola Liuzzo. And people remember Viola Liuzzo is the Detroit mother who goes to Selma to take part in the Selma to Montgomery March. So to Dr. King, Andre Adams and he's like a 1-year-old baby, being bitten by rats and dying is akin to this, right? Because it's a similar kind of the city is allowing and maintaining these kinds of conditions that people are living in. And so that campaign that spring is about building rent strikes and tenant organizing and organizing with gang members and basically trying to both take on unjust landlords, but also trying to make the city have to enforce. Chicago has probably the most developed building code system in the country at this point. But as I just mentioned, those codes are usually at this point only used for a sort of punishment. And basically the daily administration has sort of signaled to landlords in the kind of South Side and West Side ghettos that, like, you know, it's hands off. And so part of what they're trying to do that spring is to both highlight but also take on those kind of inhumane conditions. And then May 25th, 1966, a young man by the name of Jerome Huey is lynched. How many people here know who Jerome Huey is? Right. How many people know who Emmett Till is? Right. So Emmett Till, right? A Chicago teenager who goes to Mississippi, stays with his uncle, and is lynched in Mississippi in 1955, right? And his mother courageously brings the body back, opens the casket. 11 years later, in the actual city of Chicago, in the neighborhood of Cicero, so Jerome Huey's a 17-year-old. He's attending junior college, but his parents' grocery store is in trouble, so he's going to apply for a job at a freight loading company in Cicero. And Cicero is one of those sundown towns or neighborhoods. And again, what that means is that Black people can work there, but they're not safe at night. So basically, as Jerome Huey is coming back from this interview, 4 young white men attack him, beat him with a bat so hard that his eyes like pop out of his skull, and he dies 2 days later in the hospital. It's 11 years after the lynching of Emmett Till. Jerome Huey has been lynched in Chicago. And I stress this because I think sometimes, and this is absolutely true, some of what racism and inequality outside the South looks like is polite and bureaucratic and policy, but sometimes it's violence. And yet that violence is treated very differently, as evidence from the fact that most of us raised our hand and know who Emmett Till is, but don't know that 11 years later, well into the civil rights movement, a young man is lynched in the city of Chicago. That is part of the trigger to that the Chicago Freedom Movement to do these open housing marches into these sundown neighborhoods in the city, to basically break the fear, there's all of these neighborhoods that are basically all white in the city, even in 1966. And like Amber just mentioned, Dr. King will talk about and Andrew Young and many people in SCLC will talk about these open housing marches being more terrifying than anything that they experience in the South, in part because it's thousands, what Andrew Young will say, like thousands of white men and women and children are like throwing rocks and throwing firecrackers and, yelling like horrible, nasty things and throwing feces and just, it's horrible. And about a week into it, Dr. King is hit in the back of his head with like a stone the size of a fist. It splits his scalp. He doesn't lose consciousness. But it's horrible. And many of those gang members are participating in those marches. They're serving as marshals. They're bringing baseball mitts to catch all the rocks and bricks that are being thrown at them, right? So that gang organizing, like they're there, and Dr. King will talk about sort of the kind of leadership he sees from these young men. So I think also seeing these moments in the North, And I'll just tell you one more story about Lyndon Johnson. So in 1966, there's a new Civil Rights Act on the table that Johnson has introduced that he's trying to get passed through Congress. And there's a number of things. It's about strengthening school desegregation, about juries, but perhaps the most important thing is sort of taking on housing discrimination. So there's a fair housing, So, as we know, a year earlier, President Johnson, and this is where we get to the Jackson House, right? The violence that happens on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? President Johnson will use that violence to help galvanize support for the Voting Rights Act. Now we're a year later. President Johnson has another civil rights bill he's ostensibly trying to get through Congress, and we have thousands of white Chicagoans on the street beating up, throwing rocks, throwing firecrackers, destroying cars, and Johnson is silent. Right? He could have used that violence similar to how he uses it the year before, but he doesn't. And so I think this gives us a very different, because I think if you've heard of Dr. King's campaign in Chicago, many biographers, many textbooks, they talk about it as a failure. But who fails is not the movement, it's not Dr. King, it's the country, and it's Johnson. And partly we've papered over that failure because, as you may know, a week after Dr. King is assassinated, guess what happens? Johnson's like, we're going to pass that Fair Housing Act, and he gets it passed immediately. Now we don't have a living, breathing, eloquent, angry Dr. King. And so I think, kind of, again, with the kaleidoscope, it's not just about seeing Dr. King differently, it's about seeing the kind of history of the 1960s differently.
I think one of the most potent parts of the book is how to task you take the media during this period, right? And how, to your point earlier, how Dr. King both understood the positive views that he would get in northern media when he's down south, but the way that he's used and abused up north in particular by the media. And so I pulled a quote that I think might be pretty relevant to today, from 63, and he says, "Few people realize that even our authentic channels of information, the press, the platform, and in many instances the pulpit, do not give us objective and unbiased truth. Few have the toughness of mind to judge critically and to discern the truth from the false, the fact from the fiction. Our minds are constantly being invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and false facts." It seems almost prophetic to where we are today.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. What can we learn about Dr. King in particular, in the power of media and media literacy from him?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is part of why we don't know this story, part of why we've kind of Southernized Dr. King, is because that's the narrative of the time, like Amber just said, right? The media, and again, we want to remember that the United States is in the midst of a Cold War where its race relations are kind of being used by the Soviet Union, right? To say, look, they say they're a democracy, they're not a democracy. And so the United States is very nervous about this. And so, and other scholars have written much longer things about this. But part of what the US is doing is it's showcasing the Southern movement as an example of the power of American democracy. Look, we have this sort of leftover, right, problem of racism in the South, and look, we are taking it on. And so you'll see, for instance, like the sit-ins or the freedom rides or these things, right, and the movements, Birmingham, right, they will get both national and international attention as a way to show the power of American democracy. Now, many of these same national, and I focus on the print media in the book, many of these same national outlets, and in particular, we could talk about the New York Times, who are, rigorously, soberly covering the Southern struggle by the early 1960s, rigorously, soberly questioning public officials in the South, like in Birmingham or in Albany, Georgia, or in Jackson, Mississippi. When they're covering civil rights protests closer to home, in New York, for instance, again with the New York Times, those people are unreasonable. The biggest civil rights protest of the era actually happens in New York City, February 3rd, 1964, when almost 500,000 students stay out of New York City public schools to protest the fact that we're a decade after the Brown decision and there's been no desegregation of New York City schools. Dr. King supports it, but the New York Times hates it, and they call it unreasonable, they call it reckless, they call it adult-encouraged truancy, and they call it violent. There's nothing violent to people or property about it, but it is disruptive. And so I think one of the things that I had to do to be able to tell this story was to be able to see that in some ways we have taken this idea that the media was a friend to the civil rights movement and missed that it's way more complicated than that. That certainly what some reporters do in terms of exposing like what's happening around the student sit-ins in 1960 or what happens in Birmingham, right? Some newspapers do incredible work exposing that, but many of those same outlets are telling a story about the problem being in the South, putting in quotes segregation. If you talk about Detroit, a funny thing, when the New York Times covers the Great Walk to Freedom, they make it seem like it's just overrun with white people. If you know anything about the Great Walk to Freedom, it's over 90% Black. But one of the stories is all about the white people there. And then you would have no sense that the Detroit Walk for Freedom is actually about Detroit from the coverage in New York Times, because it seems like it's about Birmingham. So we have coverage like that, which is just sort of, I think, made it hard to see what was happening across the country, right? And so most of us, when we learn about the civil rights movement, we learn it in the South and don't realize that at the very same time it's taking place, right, from the Northeast to the West Coast. And I should have said this at the beginning. When I use the term North, I'm using it like Dr. King and many activists at the time did, which is to mean everything outside of the South. That in many ways, from New York to Detroit to Milwaukee to Seattle to LA, all those places took pride in not being the South, right? And so Dr. King and many others would call them the North as a way to kind of signal that sort of sense of, trying to claim that we're not the South. So when I use the term the North, that's what I'm talking about. So in many ways, this being able to tell this story would not have been possible without the Black press, right? Because just going back to what starts me down this path, right? It's looking at the Black newspapers in LA in the early 60s that is telling a story that was not the story being told in the LA Times at all. And so both the incredible importance of the Black press, but also having to read against the mainstream sort of news and to sort of see the ways that, again, the righteousness that they were covering Southern civil rights activists, or Dr. King when he's in the South, as he would put it, as long as I was safe from them in the South, that same tone very much changes. So he becomes an outside agitator. He becomes, intemperate, unreasonable. I mean, by 66, the Chicago Tribune is comparing King to the Klan and Nazis, and they're using his first name, just his first name in headlines, right? I mean, it's almost indistinguishable from like the Montgomery Advertiser. And so I think it requires us to kind of think more critically about the role of the media, and therefore, I think for people engaged in movements today, it's, I think, useful to remember that this notion that the media is a friend of kind of justice and democracy is often not true. And that part of what Dr. King is really struggling with, and many activists in the city, in Detroit, and many other places are struggling with, is having to contend with that. I mean, the Detroit News and Free Press, here's another fact, didn't cover instances of police brutality. They basically they had a standing agreement with the police department till the uprising of 1967. Like, it was only the Michigan Chronicle. So I think kind of having to take a more critical view of the media, and therefore the ways that that media view gets then taken into so many books about the era.
So I know we're coming to a time to open up the floor for questions, but I want to ask one more, just one more. So obviously the story that you are able to share with us is a lot more of a radical Dr. King and Mrs. King, a more nuanced story than what most people know and understand, or what we've been introduced to. And at times I think about that in this idea of a palatable history, like how we consume the folks who really did this work, but maybe reduce the movement down to just this moment or just this person, in what King calls, that you reference in the book, the deliberate manipulation of history necessary to maintain inequality. Right? And so I guess my last question would be, in our traditional narratives about people like the Kings or Mrs. Parks, definitely Mrs. Parks, you know, it really shadows the realities of really their lived experiences themselves as people, as individuals, as leaders, and sometimes, in my opinion, really to the point of making us as consumers of history more passive, right? Passive of consuming historical and current events, really, rather than being direct actors, which is what they were. You know, in my role, I often get the question of, well, who are our leaders now? Where's today's Martin Luther King? When in actuality, just like they were the leaders they were looking for, we are the leaders we are looking for, right? So how can we break free and break the Kings free of this narrative that that they are less radical than what they actually were?
Right. So I think, thank you for that question. I think there's a tendency, right, and to imagine, oh, I would have marched with Dr. King, right? Everybody would have marched with Dr. King, right? And I think part of that is being honest about how hard and how unpopular, right, what it took to do what the Kings did, but what lots of activists here in Detroit did. That again, it's not necessarily going to be recognized at the time, right? I think we have this myth of like, oh, Mrs. Parks and Dr. King, they were acceptable and they did it the right way, and that's why change happened. And that was not, right? That's not accurate, right? I think the third lesson that I kind of take from both Mrs. Parks and Dr. King is, in the movies, there's this kind of like, you're afraid, and then you move past fear, right? That there's that sort of and that's just not true, right? I think part of their gift, right, is the ability to move in the midst of fear, right? You're not going to not be afraid. You're going to be terrified. I think the fourth thing, and we haven't had much time to talk about this, but so one of the places that Coretta Scott King leads is she always has this global vision, right, from her Progressive Party, and so activism on. And in the early 1960s, she's doing all this anti-nuclear work. She goes to Geneva as part of a delegation from the Women's Strike for Peace, trying to get the United States and Soviet Union to sign a nuclear test ban treaty. And she is, when Dr. King gets the Nobel Prize, she really sees it both as a joy and a burden, because she sees them having a different responsibility now to the world. And she starts to push him that he needs to come out against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And from 1965 on, she is out speaking, demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. She is the only woman who speaks at kind of one of the first big anti-Vietnam rallies at Madison Square Garden in 1965, at a big mobilization in D.C. in the fall of 1965. A reporter asked Dr. King, well, did you educate her on this? And Dr. King says, no, she educated me. So I think I say that because I think also seeing the Kings having this global kind of vision and understanding that also global injustice, right, is part of what our responsibility. So not divorcing what's happening in Venezuela or Palestine or Sudan from what's happening here. And I think the last one is this point you're saying about sort of Dr. King's radicalism or his belief in disruption. I think, again, we've sort of pacified or made easy what nonviolent direct action is, right? The kind of nonviolent direct action King is talking about. He's talking about rent strikes. He's talking about tenant organizing. He's talking about school boycotts. He's talking about disrupting city life and traffic. Again, people constantly roll out King today. Oh, he didn't inconvenience people. It's like, what? He didn't take a highway. He didn't do, yes, he did. And partly he did because he understood that injustice was comfortable for too many people and that you had to make things uncomfortable or else they wouldn't be dealt with, right? Because that, again, injustice was comfortable. And so I think in many ways we see, to me, one of the most galling kind of misuses of Dr. King, and often around the holiday, right, is to sort of say to young people, you're not doing it the right way. Be more like Dr. King. Not like, be careful what you wish for, because in many ways, right, King, like many young activists today, was treated as unreasonable, as un-American, believed in disruption, was criticized for it, was the victim of many instances of police abuse and police brutality because of that, right? So I think telling an honest history, right, helps us see the way forward. And then, like Amber just said, right, that quote from King, the kind of deliberate manipulations of history, right? And the manipulations in some ways of the holiday tomorrow, right? To make it soft, to make it easy, or to make it just like, oh, if you raise your voice against injustice in this country, injustice will change. And it can absolutely change. But I think the lessons that we see from the Kings is kind of what it takes and how hard it is. But that we have to do it, right? That in many ways, I think my final point is that I think one of the Dr. King's kind of greatest gifts, even though we often associate him with, again, the pulpit, is the ways that he made so many different kinds of people see their own possibility and their own leadership, right? To use the words of today, that we're the leaders we've been looking for, and that they were the people that changed things, right? That this was an affront, before the Constitution and God, and therefore they were the ones we've been looking for. Thank you.
All right, so I think we have time for 2 questions, just 2. So raise your hands. I see one gentleman back here and a person right over here.
Thank you so much. Very good presentation. My name is Anthony DeBrogdon. I got a question. Did you talk much about him being stabbed in New York? Yeah. In the book?
Yeah. So a couple weeks before, so Dr. King, as I mentioned, wrote the account of the Montgomery bus boycott. It's called Strike Toward Freedom, right? So that book's going to come out in 1958. Meanwhile, he, in early September 1958, he tries to go to a Montgomery courthouse to see a trial of his friend, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. and they don't want to let him in. He and Coretta Scott King are there, and they start to rough him up. But there's a photographer there, and the photographer sees it, and the police decide to arrest Dr. King, and they march him down the street from the courthouse to the police station, and the photographer is taking pictures, right? And they Hap Nelson him, right? He's in his hat on the police counter. And that photo will become kind of a viral moment because it's one of the first times, like I just mentioned, most mainstream newspapers didn't cover police brutality. They certainly didn't show pictures. And so that photo of Dr. King goes out over the news wires. Meanwhile, as you might imagine, those police are pretty mad that this has been captured on film. And so when they get him in the cell, they kick him, they choke him. So the next week, he goes to New York City, and he's speaking at an outdoor evening rally for a march that's coming up. Bayard Rustin is organizing in DC called the Youth March for Integrated Schools. So it's on 125th Street, if people know Harlem. It's right down the street from Malcolm X's Speaker's Corner. And it's also right down the street from where Johnson Hinton had been brutalized by police a year earlier. And so Dr. King that night, Harlemites, just like Detroiters, just like Chicagoans, were outraged by these photos. And that night he's talking about his experience of police brutality and kind of making common cause. And this is another aspect that I think, again, turning the kaleidoscope we see, right, is that part of connecting with people in Harlem in 1958 is that sort of shared experience of police brutality. But we don't know very much about what he says that night, except that we know he talks about police brutality because of what happens the next day, which is that he is a Harlem department store signing Stride Toward Freedom when a black woman by the name of Isola Curry comes up and using a letter opener stabs him in the chest. Curry had mental health issues and had been kind of bombarded by the idea that Dr. King was a communist, right? Because this is, again, I think we sort of have airbrushed this out, right? Dr. King is being portrayed as a potential sort of communist and traitor, and so Isola Curry, again, was having mental health issues, but had heard and believed that Dr. King was standing in the way as a communist of her kind of being able to work, and so she stabs him. And he's taken to the hospital with the letter opener in his chest. One of the most bizarre details about this is that it takes a couple hours for this to get the surgical team together. So he's there in a room, and for some reason, the police bring Curry into the room so that King can identify her. But she's out of her mind, and so she identifies him. And Dr. King will tell Coretta Scott King the next day, like, he was in so much pain, but he starts laughing because this is so absurd. Why she's there, but also that she thinks she's being brought in to identify because he's the problem. So they have a long surgery. They take out the letter opener. It kind of almost grazes. It comes right between his lung and his heart. Thankfully, they didn't. If they'd taken the letter opener out at the department store, he would have died. Another story about Coretta. So they call Coretta. She flies up the next day. Bayard Rustin and Stanley Levison, who were two key advisors to Dr. King, go to meet her at the airport because they're worried she's going to be a mess. They're a mess. She comforts them, right? She's like so steady. She goes to the hospital, and one of the first things he says is, like, he doesn't want her going to prison. She needs help. And I think sometimes we sort of take that just as some sort of like sanely nonviolence and miss actually what he's saying there, which is that you don't ignore violence, you have to get to the root of it. Yeah. And Dr. King understood that her going to jail wasn't, to prison wasn't going to make her better. what we might call now a more abolitionist impulse, right? So Coretta Scott King will say to reporters who meet her outside the hospital, she will talk about that they thought that was very important. And ultimately, Isola Curry is hospitalized and institutionalized. But the other thing I discovered that comes out of the stabbing is that Dr. King develops like a long-term sort of disability from it, in the form of having these like long and extended bouts of hiccups that would go on for hours and sometimes like for a whole day. And they seem to have started after the stabbing. And one cause of like prolonged hiccups can be damage to your phrenic nerve, which goes right there. But that he would, so I think it's also interesting to think about Dr. King kind of, and Reverend William Barber had first put this idea in my head of like that Dr. King dealt with a breathing disability across his life. And so they're kind of long-term kind of health impacts of that. And so particularly when he would get tired or really stressed, like that, like he'd have these like, again, from what people say, like hours and hours or sometimes days of hiccups. So I don't know if that answered in terms of, but there's a lot of different contexts about the stabbing, but yeah.
All right, we had one more question. I think there was, yeah, right there.
Thanks so much for being here. It's been very interesting. And you alluded to it quite a bit throughout your talk, but just how the education around civil rights movement and the King family is very, especially the K-12 or around the holiday, very encapsulated of, you know, they did this, so this is what happened. Or like Brown versus Board of Education, like it was ruled on, so then it was gone. What advice do you have or insight, more from a historical perspective, on what's happening now in terms of saying, okay, if we take this action, this will be the result, and how it ties back into their family?
Can you just so I understand, can reword the question just so I can make sure I understand in terms of like the teaching of it or in terms of what we should be doing today?
Maybe both. Maybe both. Just from the perspective of, I've been hearing a lot based on what's happening in Venezuela and Minnesota and Portland and all the things, that it almost feels like we're in a new civil rights era. So, and I've been hearing from a lot of folks who lived through the 60s, like this feels very familiar. And the way it's taught is that, you know, the civil rights era happened and then it was all fixed and it was better. And then now all of a sudden it's different again.
Right.
So how to understand that continuation, maybe?
Right. I mean, I think we need to see it in a couple different ways, right? To go back to Rosa Parks. Mrs. Parks, to the end of her life, right, in 2005, was insistent, right? The struggle isn't over. The movement, don't say the movement is over. We have, you know, and the importance also that you don't keep things that you don't fight for, right? And understanding that that gains can be taken. Right? I think Dr. King's, many people will quote Dr. King, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and I think they take that out of context. So absolutely what Dr. King is talking about there is that God, that the universe is on the side of justice. But he is very clear about the myth of time in this country, and that time is neutral, if not regressive. And he will talk about the forces of evil using time better. Because I think sometimes that quote is taken to believe like, oh, things are just slowly getting better. And Dr. King vociferously disagreed with that things only get better if we push for it, if we make it. And that comes, right, at a potentially very hard cost. And so I think, obviously, what is happening today in this country is sickening, right? And I think the example of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King of what it takes to stand up to kind of authoritarianism or segregationism or people who would treat others as disposable, and our responsibility to do that, but also how hard that journey is, and the importance of kind of doing it collectively, right? So I think the other thing, we've spent a lot of time, and obviously my book is on Dr. King, but my book is also on, and there are many books that this is not done by one person, right? And so building, community groups, building community actions, building sort of our capacity to be together to press against what's happening. Because again, going back to what I see as Dr. King's greatest gift, which is that his courage made people feel like they could be courageous, right? It wasn't just only solo courage, right? But that collectively, right, we can press against that kind of inequality.
Thank you so much.